All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. Polling week is coming to a close. Our time with CNN's Harry Enten is coming to a close, and we have saved the wonkiest conversation for last. This episode, we're really talking about kind of polling for polling's sake, different kinds of polling through history, and in particular, the kinds of polls that help us make sense of midterms. It is time, folks, to talk about the generic ballot. Everyone is so excited. I can hear it. I can sense it. Here is, yes, Harry Enten of CNN. Hello, Harry. Welcome back.
You know, when you say generic ballot, I must say a smile creeps across my face. That the only other time you'll see is when I'm at Carvel about to order a hot fudge sundae, whipped cream, chocolate sprinkles, chocolate crunchies, and a cherry on top.
We call this the Harry Enten polling surge.
Yes. Very nice. That is Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kelly Carter Jackson of Wellesley. Hello, Nikki. Hello, Kelly.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Nikki battling through coming off of an illness and now dreaming of a hot fudge sundae, which is really the way to get fully out of being sick. I think that's a good call.
I think that's right. I think the endorphins released by that really get you over the end hump.
I concur.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
concur.
So Harry, we should, we are going to let you wonk out on some of these things, but we are a history show, and there is some interesting history here because, as far as I can tell, this story can begin in 1937, which is when Gallup asked a series of questions of Americans. They asked stuff like, do you own a car? 56% of Americans did. Or do you have a telephone? Half of Americans did. And they also asked this question in 1937. What candidate for Congress from your district do you think you will vote for in the next congressional election? The Democratic candidate, the Republican candidate, or some other party candidate? So that is the generic ballot, right? I think people can tell that those are generic terms. But how much of a innovation is that, so to speak? And, how much did that sort of change the nature of polling, and how much has that continued to be a sort of real tool in the polling industry?
I mean, you look at the Roper Center archives, which, is this polling archive that folks like myself will dig into to try and find old poll questions. The generic ballot is as old as that archive. It's one of the earliest questions that's sort of been asked in modern polling. It is a question that, to be honest, when you're starting off polling, you have no idea if it's going to work or not, right? Especially in an era in which, people would vote for individual candidates much more to the degree than they do now, where it really is the party label. But it has tended to work. It's one of the best questions that you can ask in terms of understanding where the race for Congress is going, especially in midterm elections. In presidential elections, the generic ballot hasn't been nearly as accurate over the years. But certainly in midterm elections dating back since 1938, that generic ballot question has done a pretty gosh darn good job of telling you which way the winds are blowing. And one of the things that I think is so fascinating about the generic congressional ballot is that unlike presidential elections, where let's say if you plot sort of the polling a year out against the final result, you'll sort of get this mishmash, and it's very clear there really isn't a high correlation. In fact, there's a pretty gosh darn high correlation between the generic ballot, even a year and a half out, with the eventual result. And that's in large part because it turns out that the generic ballot kind of follows a pretty usual path in which the early generic ballots will tend to underestimate the party out of power to a similar degree over the years. So it's a very valid question, at least from a 25,000-foot point of view.
Does that suggest that candidate quality doesn't matter that much at the congressional level?
It's a good question insofar as that how can this measure taking so far out and a measure that doesn't mention specific candidates do so well? There are two things I point out. One, it's all relative, right? If you get within 5 or 6 points on the national level 18 months out, I think you're doing pretty well, but that still leaves a lot of room for candidate quality. The other way I'll sort of note that candidate quality can still play a role is that you can have, 40 candidates that really make a difference in a good way for the Democrats. And you can have 40 candidates that really make a big difference in a good way for Republicans, and they kind of cancel each other out. I would still say candidate quality matters. We see it. It does matter less than it has historically, but it tends to cancel out in large part, though not always.
I'm really glad you answered that question because there does seem to be a little bit of a tension here of like two of the truisms I feel like you hear about midterm elections are these big fundamental forces that the generic ballot gets at really do play a huge role. And then the other truism you hear is like it's about the local race and about the actual candidates. And so there is a little tension there. But maybe, Harry, what you're saying in terms of like the use of the generic ballot, you're saying and the way that some candidates will cancel each other out. Are you saying it's important to look at the generic ballot to get a read on sort of the whole country? But like, is a generic ballot useful if you go down to this district in this state and look at what the generic ballot says there? Or at that point, should you be looking really at the candidates?
I think you want to be doing both. Certainly when it comes to the nation, I think the generic ballot does a good job of telling us what the national environment is. When it comes down to the individual districts, what we often will see is if the generic ballot says, generic Republicans favored by 20 points, but in fact, the horse race shows that the named Democratic candidate is favored by 5 points over the named Republican candidate, that the named candidates will start to move towards the generic ballot. It won't necessarily go all the way over, but it is the fundamentals of the district. Look, sometimes there are candidates who vastly outrun the fundamentals. That used to be the case more in the past than it is today, but there is still, look, Maine 2nd District, right? Jarrett Golden, the Democratic candidate, won there, I believe, by high single digits back in 2020, even as Joe Biden lost in Maine 2nd District by high single digits. So there are candidates who outrun the fundamentals. There still are candidates who outrun the fundamentals, but it's not, like back in the early 1990s in which you would see, these Southern Democrats outrunning Bill Clinton by gobs and gobs of percentage points. That really doesn't exist as much anymore.
I have a question just wondering about like process and strategy going forward, because if this is something that has been sort of tried and true for a long time, how are people thinking about what are new ways to poll people or innovative ways to poll people that gain more insight? Like, do we see that this is pretty much a consistent way of doing things, or are there ways that people are actively thinking about how they might gain more nuance or how they might predict things a little bit more closer? Or is it just, this is the system, it works?
So I think there are two separate ways to answer that question. The first is, well, maybe three separate ways. The first is obviously weighting matters so much, and you're always trying to figure out how do you get the correct percentage of, people that actually match the population. So that's always an ongoing battle. Second, what you'll often see is, this is especially the case among pollsters who are polling for campaigns, they'll message test, right? They'll ask an initial ballot question, and then they'll sort of give a biography in the messages of the individual candidates and see if that moves things. And that may give you an insight that the initial ballot test won't, especially the further you are from an election, and especially when one candidate has a greater name recognition than the other. The third thing I'll note is that, Monmouth University has been trying some different ways of asking different candidate questions. Instead of asking the two in a horse race, they may say, okay, are you definitely going to vote for this candidate? Probably, probably not, definitely won't. So you're looking at the candidates individually. We'll see how well that way of polling actually works, whether it really does make a difference or whether we just get at what we're doing. But there are pollsters who are trying to innovate. And, I obviously, as someone who's looking at these numbers day in and day out, I welcome that innovation, whether or not it actually turns into something. That's something we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah.
But, I think this also brings up something that's worth keeping in mind, which is that good polling is hard and expensive. And that, and so sometimes I think even, I saw this at 538, but, I feel like a lot of times I would like walk into the office and see you and Nate just like grumbling about, gosh, I just want a good poll from this race. And you're like, why isn't there polling on this race? But it's like, it's hard and it's expensive. And who's going to actually pay for that polling? Right. And maybe, correct me if I'm wrong here, Harry, but I mean, I feel like one thing to keep in mind is I would rather not look at like a sketchily done one-off random poll in some district. That's where I'm more like, let me go back to these fundamentals. Let me look at the generic ballot. Let me look at some of these more things. There's going to be some races that are going to be polled up like crazy by a bunch of great blue chip pollsters, but other places where I'd rather sort of trust those fundamental things. And so I think it helps you just kind of like gauge, like, what am I really looking at here?
Yeah, I love the blue chips, the things that are reliable, the things I can go back to, the things I can count on. And I think sometimes, there is that sort of fight between innovation and between just do what works, man. And, in this day and age in which, obviously polling has become more expensive, at least by phone, because it's harder and harder to get somebody on the phone, in which, people are relying more and more on non-probability online samples in which you're weighting to things. I still think that there's a lot of money sort of in pollster talk in sort of using the things that we know have worked all along. And even in an era in which the polls have missed in 2020 by plenty, missed in 2016 by not nearly as much, we still get a very good idea of what's going on. The generic congressional ballot was perfect in terms of gauging the national House vote in 2018. What was it, off by 4 points in 2020? Off by 4 points on a range from minus 100 to plus 100. Being off by 4 is really being off by a small amount.
Yeah.
As a non-polling expert, I often hear about campaigns' internal polls and their internal polls being better than the external polls that we have. Is that just mythology around campaigns, or are there more accurate polls that aren't necessarily something the public has access to? What's the difference between those internal and the external polls?
One is that the main reason that you really are conducting an internal poll, if you're a campaign, is to know what messages work and what messages don't work, right? Trying to figure out strategically, what are you going to do? It doesn't really help you to know that you're up by 2 or down by 2. That doesn't really change necessarily the way you're messaging. Now, that may be different for, a committee, right? Like the NRSC may be trying to determine whether they're going to be putting money into Georgia versus Arizona versus Pennsylvania versus New Hampshire, knowing which races are close and which ones aren't. That is helpful. But in terms of whether or not the internal polls are better than the public polls, we don't really know the answer to that, because a lot of the internal polls are not published, for our eyes to see. That being said, if you talk with the quote unquote people who do have a lot of access to them, they do believe that the internal polls are better. And that wouldn't surprise me insofar as, these are folks who are getting paid to get it right or get it wrong. And if you get what you pay for. And so a lot of these polls are very high quality that are being done by campaigns, while some of the public stuff isn't nearly as of the same quality, but there are plenty of public polls that are quote unquote high quality as well.
I've always thought, or who are going to be the ones who are going to talk about their internal poll? It's the ones whose internal polls were right. No one's going out there after an election and be like, oh, we screwed up all our internal polls. So it's kind of a skewed narrative a little bit of like the internal polls are always right. Though I also agree, again, like this stuff is expensive, and who's really incentivized to spend real money on it? Well, it's the campaigns.
Do we know how much it costs to do
Oh, yeah, that's a good question, Harry.
Tens of thousands of dollars.
Yeah. And I mean,
go ahead.
And you hinted at it, but like these days, right, to get 400, 500 people to actually answer a long poll takes weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks of calling hundreds and hundreds of, maybe thousands of people, right? I mean, it's a slog. It's a slog, for sure. All right. A couple of things that this sort of gets at, you've mentioned this, but, fundamentals. There's also this notion of thermostatic elections. I don't know if you want to define that, Harry. But, when we talk about this stuff, like what are the things that for people to keep in mind when we just sort of take 3 steps back and say midterm elections tend to be this?
I think midterm elections tend to be elections in which the president's party loses power. The midterm penalty. That is the thing I go back to over and over and over again. If I know nothing else, it's a pretty gosh darn good bet to bet against the president's party. Since basically, I believe, 1870, the president's party has lost power in the House relative to the power they had before the election. Every election but 1934, 1998, and 2002. This is a response to essentially negative feedback, from government policy to election outcomes. People like to move the government back towards the middle of the spectrum.
And that's what thermostatic means, right? Yes. It's sort of like it controls the temperature, right? And if it gets colder, people like to get it hotter. If it gets hotter, people like to get it colder. Yeah,
exactly. And some of that is more than that. We know that the presidential penalty is exacerbated when the president's approval rating is lower. So, if you were to take a step back and you were going to say, okay, what do I expect to happen in 2022? Well, knowing nothing else, if it's a midterm election with a Democratic president, that's strike 1 against the Democratic Party. And strike 2 would be that President Joe Biden's approval rating is stuck in the low 40s. Look, each election is different. Things can get weird. There are factors this year that haven't necessarily existed in past years. Most notably, of course, the overturning of Roe v. Wade. But if you were to bet based upon what we know from history, you would bet on a pretty good Republican evening.
And without getting too into the kind of like issue stuff, because I think those big trends are really the thing to look at. But, this idea that often the economy is really at the heart of a lot of elections, and that presidents are judged often on economic indicators. And, I think there's an interesting conversation popping up even right now. And, in this moment, who knows what it'll be a couple of weeks from now. But, Roe v. Wade seemed to be like a big defining factor in this election. But now, as we're recording this, maybe it's tightening a little bit and Republicans are coming back. And I've seen a few people point to, well, you know what? Maybe it's actually just gas prices, right? Maybe gas prices were high in the spring. They went down in the summer. Now they're back up. And maybe that's the fundamental thermostatic thing to look at, because that's more tied to the economy and inflation and all these things. So I'm not trying to box you into sort of making a prediction about which factors will be key here, Harry. And not to say that Roe v. Wade and women's rights is not one of those big fundamental issues, but I do think like you just have to look at these like underlying things and just always keep those in mind.
You absolutely need to keep those things in mind. Look, the economy studies show matters more in presidential elections than it does in midterm elections. But you look at what's the number one issue this year. It's the economy and or inflation, depending which pollster you look at. You look and you say, okay, which party is trusted most on the economy and or inflation? It's the Republican Party. That seems to be a dominant issue during this campaign. Gas prices, you mentioned gas prices. Gas prices can either be thought of as a separate issue from the economy inflation, but I tend to think that they are one and the same, and it just adds to the perception that things are a little bit out of control when you're seeing, yourself having to pay $4 on average per gallon at the gas station. So that would not surprise me at all that ultimately, the Democratic Party's hopes ride and die on the price of gasoline, on the price of vegetables at the supermarket, on the things that hit people's pocketbooks.
Yeah.
As we wrap up, and I want to come back to this generic ballot thing. Harry, I did find an article you wrote for CNN, as you were hinting at, is about 18 months ago, saying, look, if you look at this generic ballot thing, 18 months out, you can probably have a good sense of where things are headed. Were you worried that you were writing yourself out of a job there? If I just need to read one article from Harry Enten 18 months before an election and kind of know where it's headed, what do we need you for?
Let me be very clear. If I was ever going to write myself out of a job, it would have been my statements about Donald Trump when he first declared in 2015.
Yeah, I was there.
A lot of people would have been out of the job.
And you're still here. So there you go.
Exactly. I don't think you get penalized for getting things right. I will say, look, I've written my share of articles that have been wrong. Now I tend to take more, the older you get, the more nuanced you try to be, the more you leave yourself open to, exit stage right, sort of this escape clause. But I really do think there are a few safer bets in politics than betting against the president's party in a midterm. And I think, at least when it comes to the House, and I think that in the next few weeks, that will probably come to forbear again and will turn out to be true. Unfortunate for the Democrats, but very happy times for Republicans.
Yeah. All right. Well, we will leave it there, and we shall see. We've managed to do 3 polling episodes and not do the whole. The only poll that matters is the one on election day, thing, which I'm sure is your least favorite cliche. And also another one that people love to trot out when they have beat the polls, and then they don't seem to use very often when the polls were right. But anyway, all right, Harry Enten of CNN, thank you so much for doing this. And we'll say, of course, you are going to be all over CNN between now and Election Day and beyond. Any particular place people can catch you, or should they just watch 24/7 in case you happen to wander onto set?
You should always be watching CNN 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Just move into an airport, and then you'll just be on. Yeah.
I think your best chances to catch me tend to be in the morning hours, on the morning drive show from 6 to 9, maybe more so in the 8 going forward. And you'll never know. You might see me on Anderson Cooper, Aaron Burnett show. Anderson's on at 8 Eastern, and Aaron Burnett is on at 7 Eastern.
There you go. You're a good company man. All right. Thank you for doing this, Harry. And Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kelly Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.